Hello, this is Stephen Gelson again, and I want to welcome you to our second lecture on YouTube for our DIS 630 course. Today I think we have two or three things that we need to discuss. These are related to the readings for the week of June 1st to June 5th. First is the reading that we need to chat about regarding the definitions of disability and the multiple definitions and the potential confusion between those multiple definitions of disability, and ultimately what we're going to talk about in this class being disability policy and disability law. In the first place, I'd like to refer you both to the reading that we read in terms of demystifying disability, and then the PowerPoint, which I labeled a policy quagmire, too many models of disability. One of the things is, I think we need to ask ourselves, how can we possibly proceed with disability policy or disability law, or even a conversation about disability policy, when it appears that no one agrees with anything. There's disagreements about the definition of disability, disagreements about how to measure disability, who is disabled, how they become disabled, and why they're disabled. There's even disagreement about what should be done to address disability, whether or not when we look at policy, we look at policies that specifically address a specific type of disability, a medical explanation of disability, or a specific subset, or whether we do that in general. There clearly are the competing viewpoints and conflicting viewpoints of disability according to Emery, the reading that I'm referring to right now, where Emery really lays this out and talks about 5 different competing definitions or value statements related to our thinking about disability. The first is the biomedical discourse. This sees disability as a state of dysfunctioning body parts. Commonly in the literature, you'll hear this referred to as the medical model of disability. And I think most of us, when we enter the conversations about disability, this is what we think about, that diagnosis. You have a diagnosis of spinal cord injury, you have a diagnosis of X, Y, or Z. Those all relate to what we're calling the medical model of disability. A second kind of competing perspective, or one that you read within the disability studies literature, is commonly called the social perspectives, or disability as society's denial of opportunity to those with an impairment. And they differentiate within this diagnostic category, or this explanation, as it were, between impairment and disability. Impairment being physiological, and in this case, disability being that constructed barrier to people being able to participate, attitudes, all those other kinds of things that somehow make it more difficult for people with diagnostic conditions to be able to fully participate. Clearly, if we remember back to Goffman, we remember some of the conversations about disability as a form of social deviance, that somehow we're different. Those people with diagnostic conditions are different from typical population, therefore are deviant. Within social psychology, we're aware of this disability as an interactive, and I think what they mean by that is clearly an acknowledgement of a medical construct of disability, or a medical diagnosis of disability, a medical explanation of disability, and what happens in kind of the social world that people operate, how we move through space in terms of our jobs, school, our voting in the community, those other types of events. Finally, Emery brings us to the notion of, which comes out of the postmodern and post-structuralist discourse, really is disability as a series of social cultural constructions. And so here we're not just talking about attitudes, but we're talking about economics, we're talking about cultural kind of admonitions against impairment, all of those other kinds of things which seem to have an influence in terms of how and why we participated, who gets to participate, who has permission to participate, who has permission to work, who we encourage to work, who we encourage to go to school, those kinds of opportunities, how we make sure that our stadiums for football events are available and accessible. Part of what Emery was talking about here was, and one of the reasons why we read it, was the push for what was called the ICF, an International Classification of Functioning and Disability and Health, which was seen as an international effort from the World Health Organization, to come up with a way of classifying disability, in essence, to be measuring disability. And what we want to do is from Emery's perspective, in terms of what does he view as being what's wrong with this perspective, and then for us to kind of also look at it in terms of how this might be an issue for us in terms of when we think about policy. But clearly one of the attempts from for the ICF was to begin doing a surveillance, begin count how many people with condition X. And for me, that's one of the downsides of it. So even though they talk about wanting to look at social issues, ultimately they're talking about a diagnostic condition. But they want to count how many people have diagnostic condition X, and then what do we need to do for that in terms of policy, both locally as well as internationally. The assertion by the development of ICF, and IMRI doesn't buy it, and neither do I, is that the ICF seeks to locate an understanding of disability with what they call the intersection between the biological, social, and institutional structures. I understand that. That goes back to the social constructivist model, but part of the issue there for us is ultimately it comes down to looking at what's going on with the body. Moving beyond reductionism, the ICF intent was to claim that the ICF classification covers any function and disturbance associated with health conditions and individual society levels. Frankly, I'm not sure what that means when they said moving beyond, but clearly they're still talking about a particular body, a particular nature of our bodies. I would ask you to look at the language within the ICF and see with that. Disability as a variation of human functioning caused by the loss of abnormality or body part, difficulties an individual may have in executing activities, problems an individual may experience in involvement in life situations. These, to me, and I think to Emery, all come back to the notion somehow still talking about the body in society, the body in relationship to society. According to Emery, Emery suggests how to fix the ICF. He says when the ICF needs to look back at some of the theoretical conceptual models that underpin it. What he talks is we need to spend time thinking about and defining and redefining the nature of what we mean by impairment. What is impairment? How do we talk about impairment without it having to be exclusively the body? Because he also suggests that somehow we need to incorporate our understanding of the social model. And there he also asks us to go back and look at the biopsychosocial theoretical framework, understanding that that framework came out of a conceptualization around psychiatry. So it began from looking at diagnostic circumstances. And finally, he suggests that clarifying the meaning and implications of universalization in terms of what do we mean by how do we treat, how do we respond to diagnostic conditions. So what do I think about this ICF? Well, I think it's a classification tool that masquerades as a progressive way to look at human behavior. So it's put out there as this solution, but ultimately for me, it ends up being the same thing that it claims it's going to. But because it only applies to disabled bodies, you wouldn't use the ICF to classify a typical body or a body that's without a diagnostic condition. It used exclusively for that surveillance to count and then provide some kind of social policy response to that condition. So what does the ICF have to do with policy? Using the ICF, I believe, characterizes disability and focuses ultimately on the impaired body. Policies based upon the ICF tool, therefore focus clearly on impairment and not on a more complex and potent issue of level of policy that we're going to try and explore over the course of this semester and even begin later today in our next lecture. We really need to look at how bodies and the environment interact. It's time for a dialogue for us, a dialogue and clarification. Part of what I would like to do over the next 6 weeks and part of what I think that we need to do in our thinking and writing is think about what do we mean by the body? What is the impaired body? What is disability and how is it different from impairment? What theories would best inform disability policies and that have positive outcome for the most people? And when we talk about the most people, we need to kind of think about what that means in terms of human variation, human difference. Those of us who are taking this class, those of us who have friends who might think about taking this. I encourage you to read on. Good theory is to come. Our next lecture we'll talk a little bit about disability policy, disability law, and try and link these together. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you for participating.